Good afternoon, everybody. Ooh, that's loud. Thank you so much for being here today. We're excited to talk about our project. Like Ryan said, my name is Shana Crosson. I work at the University of Minnesota, and my focus is what is a geospatial technology consultant. I work with faculty and students at the university, and I also work with K-12 teachers to support them in using spatial technologies, GIS, with students and helping people learn how to use it. I'm going to let Jim introduce himself. Jim has brought me in on this project through the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and it's been really a great project, so we're excited to talk to you about it today.
Thank you, Shana. As was mentioned, my name is Jim Wabindato, formerly, as of very recently, with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and Ryan said 2003, I think, but it's 2023. So technically, I start with the Office of Tribal Relations on Monday in a few days. Let me kind of skip ahead. So the project origin, the scope, structure, and kind of what we did last year. We were finally able, after several years, to get this piloted in a tribal community. We'll talk a little bit more about the key takeaways, the conducting of an evaluation so that we can continue improving the program, and ultimately what we're working on for this summer. So the project origin and scope starts in January of 2020. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation had been looking to bring on a planner, somebody who had GIS skills that could work on a number of different projects for us. And we were struggling to find somebody that would come to the Twin Cities to work for ILTF. It's a great organization, and we were struggling with, well, why? We obviously didn't want to just steal all of your GIS folks from the tribal communities, because folks are where they would like to be. Ultimately, what it came down to is an identification that the pipeline, the pathways for young folks to see this as a viable career, was something that had changed. When I first started working with GIS around the early 2000s, it was kind of newer, it was sexy, it was something that certainly grabbed people's attention. But over the succeeding 15 years since then, it was just something that was part of other jobs, and I don't really get the sense that there were too many folks out there except the hardcore GIS folks. A lot of wildlife biologists, natural resource specialists, use this technology, planners use this technology as well, but it wasn't seen as an independent, straightforward career path. And ILTF set about to figure out how that would change. And since then, we have worked forward to continue making strides so that we could develop a new way for young folks to see this as a viable pathway. And for those who don't necessarily fall into GIS and related technologies, just having a much stronger understanding of spatial analysis and geospatial referencing of information, and becoming stronger and better tribal leaders as well. So as Shana brought up, the staff that have worked on this project are myself, like I said, of the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. About last summer, we brought on Josh Mizell, and Josh is here with us today, but not part of the presentation. He's a professor at Haskell, teaching GIS. Dr. Carl Sack, who is a graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and has taught GIS at Fond du Lac Tribal Ojibwe College in Cloquet, Minnesota. Carolyn Rose, also from UW-Madison. Wendy Fuller has been brought on. She originally came as the teacher for our youth in the pilot project, but has been integrated into other additional roles. And then Shana and Kate Carlson from the U-Spatial Group at Minnesota. And interestingly enough, I can owe it to Esri that the relationship with the University of Minnesota started. They had one of their grad students write an article about story maps being used to teach non-traditional geospatial information. So the arts and humanities, talking about, say, anthropology or sociology, but then tying it back to maps. And I said, well, geez, these guys are only like 5 minutes down the road. I should go find out who they are. And that's what brought Kate and Shana across our path. and it has been a journey. Like I said, all of this happened in early 2020, and so that was probably a big obstacle, dealing with the pandemic and everybody shutting down. It didn't stop us from having conversations and talking it through, but it certainly did have an impact on fundraising and implementation. So as you can see, the original project, we're trying to figure out how do we get youth engaged in a way that they could see this as a viable career path, even if they don't, especially if they don't stay in tribal country. These are jobs that pay quite well in Indian communities. It kind of depends on what the resources are for that tribal community and how well you'll get paid, but it's still rewarding all the same. So for 2022, we had accrued enough funding to pilot this project, and I pushed through to work with the Lakudere community. Make it go one more, 'cause I think circled up there. There we go. Lakudere is in north central Wisconsin. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation is located in Minneapolis, St. Paul, the Twin Cities. And then based on the relationships that our development team had, we were able to use some of our resources to support a project at through the College of Menominee Nation, which is about an hour and a half west of Green Bay, Wisconsin. Let me see, is this still me? Sure. So when I was looking at this in early 2020, I thought back to the experience that my older daughter had at the Bad River tribal community as a probably 12, 13-year-old, and a University of Wisconsin professor who is Bad River was teaching digital storytelling. She brought resources to the community for 2 weeks. The kids met for about 3 or 4 hours each day. She had some of the grad students working with the youth to better understand how to work with videos, collect video information, and edit it with computer software. And at the end, the kids got, well, technically predated GoPro, but kind of like a GoPro style camera for participating in the program. And I thought, that's an excellent model. So I started thinking in those terms, and to put it together, as you can see, our tactical program goals, the way to get things done were to identify and train adults to be mentors to the kids, have those mentors engage with tribal youth so that they understood story maps. It's a plug-in or add-on top of Esri's ArcGIS Online software, but it does not need to have a deep intensity in working with mapping to be successful as a story map. As you'll see, some of the story maps I think might have only one map at all. And ultimately, present training to kids that would allow them to learn about story maps, introduce concepts of, say, geoinquiries and some of the other data map design and data layering effects that GIS involves.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual details of what we did and what we developed for the summer of 2022. So we started working on this in November of 21 about. And I will say, I'm a teacher. I don't stand still on the thing, so I'm trying. I might move my arms a lot, but standing up here is very restrictive, but we got it. Okay, so let's take a look at what we put together. This was all based on Jim. We'd had a lot of conversations. Jim brought me, Carl, myself, and Kate Carlson were the primary instructional designers, developers on this at the beginning. And our real point was to gather existing resources and put them together in a way that we could help the adult mentors feel confident and comfortable in using this with the youth. Before I get going, how many of you know what GIS is and what it stands for? Most of you. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about geographic information systems, digital mapping, because we were working with a lot of folks who had never looked at digital maps, GIS, how you work with these tools and what the value of these tools were. So we were starting with people who had not used any of this before. So we were really debating where we were going to start. So We wanted to start with some self-paced or asynchronous materials that the adults could do on their own. So we put together a package of materials that walked, we expected a couple hours a month for 4 months, to reduce the in-person training time and have them get an exposure to what we were doing so they could come into the in-person training time with some exposure and experience and ideas. The modules we put together, I like to start with a concept called geo-inquiry. Esri has put together a number of materials or exercises, activities geared for students. They're geared for high school students, so we thought we would start with that. Those allow students to engage with the digital maps. It guides their experience through looking at the maps and how you use maps to answer questions, ask questions, answer questions, analyze information. So we started with a geo-inquiry. And I'm going to say we used Esri tools. Esri has a booth out there if you want to talk to them. Primarily because Esri's tools are the easiest, really, I think, to onboard people into GIS. So we weren't trying to sell Esri tools.
And the other nice thing in working with tribal communities and Esri is that through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, tribes have access for free to Esri software, the full software packages, and also Esri, in as much as they want to have young folks understand this, has a free K-12 program as well.
All those things were key to this decision. So that was our first module. The second module, we wanted to get people in using maps and doing cartography, styling data, learning how to add data, styling data, so really getting deeper into some of the ArcGIS Online map building. We talked about collecting data using tools like Survey 123, going out online to find data through the Living Atlas. Then we talked about telling stories and using story maps, so walking people through a story map. How many of you have made a story map before or know what the story maps are? Okay, we're going to talk a lot more about that in a little bit, what story maps are and why, as an educator, I feel like they are really an incredibly valuable tool for teaching students, helping young people gain spatial awareness and communicate and tell their stories. Then we had a module about planning your project. I'm going to tell you right now, this was not a good plan, okay? We tried it. We made a lot of changes after this. So one of the details of the plan, this is kind of what it looked like. This is our module. Is this the one we were doing? Come on. There we go. So we walked through all this. It was very formal. I'm an educator. I have to use all those objectives and blah, 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 all that gobbledygook. So we had a number of different ways that they could access this information. We had activities, hands-on things. We had some videos. We had places that they could interact with each other and have discussion. I thought it was great. We were excited about it.
And remember, this is being administered to adults.
Yes, this is for the adults. This was not intended to be for the youth. No, this one. This one. Phase 2. So that was the asynchronous self-paced activities that we walked them through all of this. The second part of this was an in-person training of the adult mentors, and we ended up just having the Coudray, the LCO adults. We did the training on the reservation. It was 8 hours over 2 days. We had them in person, and we walked through a whole lot of this content. I learned more that day, I think, than they did, and it was very, very interesting. I think it was a great exposure for them. I can't remember what else we were supposed to say about that. Good, okay. Then Coudray had a youth program. They had an existing summer program that they had students coming in for 6 weeks, I think every day for 6 weeks, and one of those days, 1 day a week, was meant to be the GIS day. Just as luck had it, Wendy Fuller is a teacher at the Coudray, the high school there. She's a science teacher. She also is a GIS, she has a master's in GIS and teaches with it in all of her classes, so is very experienced using GIS with students. We lucked into that somehow. We were very excited. So Wendy led that program. Oh, a 7th week got added. See, I wasn't involved in that. details. It was led by Wendy, as well as other people who were running the LCO summer program. I live in Minneapolis. I was available. We had meetings with Wendy on Zoom and talked through how things were happening. This picture is one of my favorites because the day before the program started, part of the program was ILTF was providing computers to the students, and the LCOs was with middle school students, but the computers hadn't arrived yet. So Wendy and I were on a Zoom call at like 4 o'clock the day before. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I had just been up there, and I noticed they had a brand new paved parking lot. It was gorgeous. You know, the pavement was just smooth. And I said, Wendy, do you have any sidewalk chalk? And she's like, I do. So we sent the kids outside all day in the morning to draw maps on the parking lot. And I think this was a really interesting opening for the kids. There's more about the kids in here. Well, let's talk about this. Some of the online modules, the challenges, I will say there were some technical challenges, sending people to work on these tools who haven't looked at them before. Some people just jump right into it and go with it, and other people ran into a little more. They wanted, when you're learning a new thing, sometimes it's easier to have someone right there to help you out. There were some technical challenges with the products or the things that we chose from Esri. Carl says they're errors. I say they're just different ways of looking at things, but those did cause some frustrations for people, so we made some choices about which things we were going to use and not use. The directions were a little confusing. Any of you who use ArcGIS Online understand the new viewer, the old map viewer versus the new viewer, or the classic viewer versus the new one. Understand that that's an issue. It's not so much anymore, but it certainly was last summer in what we were going to do. So that caused a lot of confusion. It's hard enough to teach people a new software, but when you have to teach it to them twice with two very different interfaces, it's not fair to the learner at all. It's just overwhelming. So fortunately, that challenge is done now because the new map viewer is good. We're sticking with that.
And if you'll recall, as Shana mentioned, we were using Esri activities, and most of their activities had been written for the old viewer, but they wanted people to start using the newer. So we were just at a point in time where that transition was a tough time for us to deploy.
I would say another issue with the online self-paced modules was that there wasn't a lot of context for the learners, these were the adult mentors, to understand why we were using this or why we were going to do this. They were learning this kind of in a vacuum, I would say. So that was our fault, and we didn't prepare enough for that. And as we all know, having gone through the last 3 years, we are at about 3 years, aren't we, March 20th, or about when everything shut down 3 years ago, online and self-paced just doesn't work for everybody, and that's okay. But we figured that out, that this is not the best way for everybody to learn. Some really good things that came from that. We found that they were, the resources we had put together were very useful for the youth, the students. Wendy pulled some of them and used them with the kids, as did the folks in Menominee. The Map in a Minute are great activities through Esri. We did some other things that we thought were too confusing, but they were successful and they worked really well. Challenges, again, were planning for an unknown level of prior knowledge. We had Wendy, who had a master's degree in GIS, and then we had a number of others who were there who had never heard of GIS, had no idea what it was. And if you work in GIS, the learning curve can be fairly steep. So there was trying to work with that unknown preparation. It was a very short time to cover a lot of ground. And I will say, I think we put too much into a short period of time, and that's something we learned. We had great group participation. They were awesome and really stuck with us. And we learned, I think, just watching the mentors work with this material gave us a lot of ideas of what we could do differently for this year. My big takeaway, as a teacher, I work with students and young people all the time. We shouldn't have started with the tech. We should not, I know better than that, we should not have started with the tool. We should have started with the why, and why are we doing this, and what are we trying to do with this? Usually the 13, 14-year-olds don't need a lot of support with the tech, but they need to know, the students need to know why, as did the adult mentors. In the world of GIS, especially with story maps, there is a tension, at least among educators. Does the map come first or does the story come first? And I have an ongoing dialogue with some of the people at Esri about which comes first, the story or the map. I sit very, very strongly on the side that story comes first, that story will lead you to map, and without story, the map is meaningless. So we are taking it this year, we're really focusing on that. We're doing story first, and that will lead us to map. We will always include map and spatial, and what the map is does not always have to be an ArcGIS Online map. There are many ways of mapping our place and our space, and those things are all going to be included in this year's work. So we're going to focus on story, and I think we'll hopefully have a better understanding both of the adult mentors and the youth coming in. How am I doing, Jim, time-wise?
Wonderful.
Wendy she's a high school teacher. Again, we were very lucky to have her come in. Look how organized she was. She came in every day with a very clear set of lesson plans and what she was going to do. Like any good teacher, this was an outline, and she rolled with the flow. You cannot teach middle school students and expect to stick to a plan. So she had these really awesome lesson plans. One of them, I don't know if this is the right one. Yeah, it was something to do with the one that we did the chalk on the ground, and we had them think about their place. So along with mapping is really becoming spatial, place-based understanding of the place where they live and of their community. So we had them draw maps from different perspectives. How did these different maps tell different stories? So for example, one of the projects was to draw a map that they would do telling their friend how to get to their house, let's say. And that map is going to look one way. How are you going to draw a map if you're telling someone who's not from your community how to find the elementary school? That map's going to look different, right? And how you tell people where to go. And you will have a chance to practice that a little bit later on. We're going to do that exercise. So Wendy did a great job pulling all these things together. And from these, I can't remember if we have that here. Oh, here we go. We used exit tickets. It's a pedagogical tool where every day at the end of the day, Wendy had them answer a couple questions. What did you learn today? What did you like? What did you not like? And let me tell you, middle school students will tell you what they didn't like. They're very good at that. So we learned really quickly about what worked with them and what wouldn't. And here we were trying to teach them GIS, and we realized really quickly they did not want to be on the computer all day. So we really had to think, and obvious, isn't it? Now when I think about it, that was obvious. So we really, for this year, we really thought about that and how we're going to integrate, how are we still going to get them exposed to GIS and do some mapping, but not have them on the computer all day. Those exit tickets were really, really important. It was confusing, but they didn't give up, and that's what we want to see. That's probably more important, that they learn how to learn and not give up, than learning how to make an actual map, right? Lesson learned, less computer time is better. That was a clear message from the kids, and that we have incorporated for this year's program. So another things that Wendy had the students doing, they went out in the field. You can see in the lower corner that they're filling in, I think, a survey 1, 2, 3, taking pictures of places on the campus of the college. They went out in the field. They met with the Glyphwick folks to talk about place names. So they did a lot of things around using the maps, all in terms of spatial awareness, spatial thinking, place-based awareness, and place-based learning.
And I'll insert for most folks that Glyphwick in our part of the world is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's a multi-jurisdiction ceded territory enforcement for natural resources and gathering rights.
Because a part of this was also career exploration and getting students to see opportunities for careers. A lot of it was focused, Wendy's a science teacher, so she focused a lot of it on science and conservation, and wild rice was a very big part of this. I'm a historian, so I immediately focused things more on the history and telling those stories. So it was a nice mix of the topics that we included. We did have the students create story maps. While none of them used ArcGIS Online to make maps, that's okay. I think in our big vision, that's what we wanted. I think that was unrealistic, and we shouldn't have expected that. But we did have them start seeing how to use the maps and how to tell a story. And ultimately, that, I think, was the more important piece. And so you'll see in a little bit how we've really flipped the program for this summer to focus on story above map. Do you want to talk about nomination?
As it were, Carl Sack, Dr. Sack from the Fond du Lac Ojibwe College had other contacts. And so in reaching out to let some of his colleagues know what we were up to, the Carolyn Rose, who you saw her name earlier, and Kate Flick, who's at the College of Menominee Nation, were very interested. They had their own EPA grant and were going to be working with kids in the field. And what they decided to do is use our online modules as a way to get their we call them mentors on our side, but their intern mentors through the paces so that they would be able to work with the kids to use story maps. It was a slightly different approach, but the Indian Land Tenure Foundation is in place to help people better understand how to use tools and provide resources. So in talking with our president, he was very comfortable with us sharing that beyond just the project that we were quote unquote paying for with LCO. And the College of Menominee Nation was a great experience to have them come in, especially to evaluate the online modules. Their group, as a body, had much more experience with GIS, and so again, it was very helpful for them to go through those paces. As you can see here, they incorporated those module framework and lessons for their adult mentors. And one of the biggest differences was that our group with LCO were junior high kids, mostly 13 and 14-year-olds, where the Menominee project through EPA was designed more for career development, and so they're dealing with older high schoolers and college-age kids. So their target audience was different, and they weren't going to be using our framework to actually teach the kids specifically. We had been building this for a while, and we were very excited to get this implemented. It was a humbling experience, I will say. I was joking with Shana earlier this morning. When going through this, I felt like the old fogey. I had us grand ideas on what they were going to do, but in the end, the kids were very realistic about what they were willing to do for themselves. To do the actual evaluation, we built in a number of tools, and as Shana said, we were very blessed to have Wendy as our primary instructor because she added additional tools that we just hadn't gotten time to develop. The pre and post programming student surveys were developed by our team so that we could see where the kids were at the beginning of the project and where they were at the end of the program. The exit tickets were a real-time experience, and at the end, I asked the development team, Carl, Shana, Kate, and Caroline, and then Wendy as well, to tell us, what are your thoughts? Shana's been sharing some of them as we've gone along, but ultimately, like I said, what went well, what went poorly, and what they would change was going to be critical for what we would do going forward, because this wasn't designed to be a one-off. Again, if you'll remember at the beginning, I talked about trying to develop a pathway for young kids to see this as a way to better understand information and ultimately to find those few who do actually want to go into GIS technologies. So the answers were reviewed and kind of suggested some of the outcomes, I guess. Yeah, we can kind of peek at that a little. And I don't have it in a printed format, but it is something that we would be able to share. What you might not see is it says it's about 30 pages. The first part is the cover and a table of contents. And so if you review this, you'd be able to see clearer, more details on the plan, the original goals and structure. It talks about the asynchronous online coursework, what we did with the kids. You can see another picture of the young folks. Again, Wendy has got the green shirt kind of bent over with the long ponytail, working with the kids. There's a little bit about Menominee. Let me see here. And the most important pieces, so in working with Shana and the team and looking at this, we talked about the overall structure of, and we use the term pedagogy. What it really means is, how do you teach? So we wanted to look at the big picture of how are we teaching, and it goes through a number of pieces that we can get into greater detail. The youth curriculum. As you saw, there was an excellent lesson plan. That wasn't something that we set out from the beginning. We just didn't have the time and resources to figure out what that was going to look like. So Wendy really provided that, but it also then structured what we wanted to do with the kids going forward. And then finally, going into the online modules and what does that mean, and getting the adults ready to work with the kids. Let me see. So you can see this is a little bit of what the pre looks like. Simple questions like, I know how to create a Google Doc. I know how to search engine to find information. I'm comfortable interpreting data in order to understand a topic or project. So it wasn't specific to GIS, but in geospatial thinking and research. There's another version of, actually that's the same. And what she did for herself, which was, again, a teacher thing to do, is resources needed so that they knew, oh yeah, actually for the evaluation, I have all of them in there. And then finally, what an exit ticket looks like. And during the kids' presentation at the end of the summer, there was a short article printed in the local newspaper, and you can see all of the kids who participated in this. So again, we can make sure that if you'd like, you can get a copy of that evaluation. Yeah. And it was a great, like I said, it was a very humbling experience to go through the evaluation and the post-wrap.
Jim did the big writing, so thank you, Jim, for doing that. I just wrote my part.
Thank you, Jim. We do have a question back here.
Yes.
I just wanted to know where and how we can get a copy of that.
I'll show you in just a second. We'll give you a, yeah.
It's a good question, though. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me go back to that while I'm, so if you want to pull up these slides, come on, all the way back. Nope, wrong way.
Eventually, the presentation will be available through the NTLA, but we're kind of shortcutting some of that, too, to make it available for you sooner.
So if you can see, and can you see at the bottom it says slides, that z.umn.edu, and I should have put a QR code. I will say, I just got back from a 10-day international trip, and I'm jet lagged, so I think that's also part of why this isn't. TLSNC23. So if you type that z.umn.edu/TLSNC23, you'll get the slides, and that should have the links to the evaluation. So. And if you would like, pull that up now, because we are going to do an activity. I'm a teacher. We don't just sit and talk at you. We'll come back to that in a second. I can go. Got it. So, what are we doing differently for 2023? We spent a lot of time talking about this. Do you need the Z link again? Okay. It's z.umn.edu/ let me just put it up on here. I can't do it in the editing. Jim, you start talking, and I'm going to put it on the slide.
So the 2023 changes, and it's not on here, but what we are doing in the interim period is keeping it regional. I say keeping it within a day's travel distance so that if things really mess up, we can get to the hot spots and deal with them right away. For 2023, we're going beyond the single community, and we're looking at 4 to 6 tribal communities. I've got 3 that Josh and I have already lined up, and in the long term, we'd be looking to add maybe 2 or 3 more so that we can have a good complement. Again, we learned a lot from working with one group of kids. I'm sure we'll learn a heck of a lot more working with 60 to 70 young folks across different age ranges as well. And again, keeping it within distance that we can troubleshoot. Ultimately, working with Josh, we're trying to take this national. We're still collecting funds to make it national, but that's why we share with you guys the experience that this is something I think can benefit all tribal communities. One of the communities that is on there is actually with a nonprofit in the Twin Cities. So from the get-go, we have been finding a way so that we can work with urban tribal youth, because a lot of times those are some of our forgotten kids when it comes to tribal programming. So that was built into how we wanted to address the deployment for this program.
We've redesigned the online modules, and I will get a slide in a second that's going to have the slide link again. We completely redesigned the modules, changed the order what we're using with the self-paced experience for the adults, and we're adding webinars. So we will be hosting three live webinars with the folks who are participating, so that there's an opportunity to do some live demonstration, a little more answering questions as we go for the folks that need it. If they don't need it, they don't need to attend, and that's totally fine. Next one. We changed the programming. We're changing to offer sort of 3 different levels. Meant to be at this 25, 50, and 75-hour level, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. And that's contact hours with the students, with the kids. So, because every community we work with has a different structure for their summer programs or a different idea of what they wanted to do. So that's how we came up with these 3 levels. It also allows a community to start with the 25, the lower level, and then grow it in the next couple of years, or kids to start with the lower one and grow it.
When Dr. Sack and I were starting our conversation, we were looking at 100 hours, and like I said, looking at like a summer institute for a couple weeks where kids could come in and really get engaged with deeper GIS technologies. And it is still a dream. In talking with Josh, I think that's something that we'll eventually get to. And those kids are going to be self-selecting, and there's a lot of value to having that available to them and building in resources that a lot of our non-Indian kids get in their school systems or from their parents. With the tiers, it also allows for, like Wendy was saying, when I was talking to tribal communities to find that first pilot, I probably had 2 or 3 that said, we'd love to do this, but we can't do 100 hours. And even LCO said, yeah, we can try 100. The realistic application is they probably got close to about 50 hours. And so when we were designing it for this year, 50 hours is kind of our benchmark training that gives them enough introduction so that they understand perhaps what data point mapping, styles, layers, and geo-inquiries might incur, but they won't get too deep into the weeds to actually work through too many projects. And then the 75 becomes the institute model, and 25 hours is what we can do to work with a lot of tribal communities who have substantial and wonderful programming and want to add this on.
So we're also including a GIS, I wouldn't have used expert, GIS professional. So it could be someone in the community, it might be one of us, but someone who works with GIS, and I see several of you out there, who could work with the kids in your community, come in and talk to them about what's going on, about how to use GIS, why mapping is important in Indian country. We also are trying to develop turnkey resources so you could literally just pick this up and go, and you wouldn't have to do anything to it. We know that isn't going to work for everybody, but that's a starting point, and so it's there, and I'll talk about those resources in a minute. But we also know people are going to adapt them to their needs, and that is 100% okay.
And by turnkey, she's referring to the fact that you won't have to do the creative to figure out what those lesson plans need to include, and to meet certain pacing and style. We'll have provided that information. And it also works very well because I skipped over at the very beginning, which is having worked in Indian country for over 20 years, it's difficult. You build something wonderful with one person. So I've got Shana, who does this great program. Well, her spouse takes a job somewhere else, she moves. You know, something happens, she takes a different job. Now all of a sudden, this wonderful thing we've built for our tribal community dies on this vine because there's nobody else to pick up the pace. And so when we say mentors, I often refer to the fact that we'd want to have somebody who probably understands the GIS technologies and then somebody who's tied into the schools, because that gives us now two people. It's unlikely they're both going to leave at the same time, and it helps to ensure program longevity.
There we go. Okay. So let's take a look at some things. This is the fun part. So this slide has, you can access the slides there, that z.umn.edu/ it's TLSNC23. So if you pull up the slide deck and you go down to, this is on slide 25, we're going to look at some story maps. A few of you raised your hand that you knew what story maps were or had built one or had seen them before. So we're not going to take 10 minutes on this, that's too long. But this is an example, actually, of what, this is one of the activities that's in this set of modules coming that we're going to release in next week. So the goal of this is to get the adult mentors to explore story maps, to start seeing what story maps are and what we can do with them. And then the adult mentors can choose to use this with the students or not. Let's just take a look at one. So this top set of story maps were things built by organizations or professional communities. This set down here were built by students. We thought it was important that the adult mentors see both what the sort of a professionally built story map looked like, but also what students are capable of doing. So I'm just going to go to this one. You are, please go ahead and, if you need me to leave, how about I leave that up just for a second longer? Go ahead and get to the slides and go to slide 25 and pull up this link to the story maps if you'd like to. Okay. I'll go back to that in a second. I'm just going to pull up this one, The Voices of Grand Canyon. And like anything, when we teach students how to do to be responsible digital citizens, we want them to evaluate who put this story map out, who built this. Is this legitimate information or not? So we walk them through who made this. We look and say, okay, it was built by the Grand Canyon Trust. Is that a reliable source? We want students to look at that and ask that question. So when we have the adults do this, we expect them to do that. But when you work with the students, it's important to walk them through all these different steps. So this is an example of a story map, and we always talk about at the beginning, how did this story map grab you? What's it doing? What story are you telling through this product? And in this case, they use the visuals. Almost every single story map you see is going to start with a very prominent, impactful image or visual. And it's a part of, from my perspective, from the pedagogical perspective, it's getting students to learn how to communicate with visuals, because we live in a visual society. It's how to combine the text and the visuals and the maps all together to tell your story. So we talk, when I work with students with this, we talk a lot about the function or the role of this big visual right here. What does this do for us? And as we scroll through here, you can see you can navigate through here by clicking there. It's going to take you down to Colleen's story, where you can see the different levels of information that are being used here. We do not expect a 13-year-old to produce something like this after 25 hours, okay? That's not the expectation. But they can do something around this, using this tool to tell their story, to tell their community's story, or to tell a story of their choosing.
And again, as people, I mean, that's how we transmit information from generation to generation, is through our stories. And this just happens to be a new style or a new format that we can use with our community members to share that information. Last summer, in fact, actually just 7 miles down the road, at Pala, they had a grant from ILTF to host high school interns, completely unrelated to this project, but they had a returning student who had kind of burned through the projects that the supervisor laid out, and she was asking, well, what do I do with this young lady? She's great, we got to keep her engaged. I actually got her to pair up with their GIS technician and had them actually take, instead of doing a PowerPoint presentation on community issues, they did a story map presentation on those same community issues. And the supervisor said, oh my God, this is so much more vibrant, this is so much more engaging in sharing the same information that I have had the kids working on in the past. And she loved this, that it was a dynamic way to, again, engage people in the stories visually with audio visuals as well. You can put language from your community into there, voices from the actual people telling stories, for instance.
This one, for example, does a great job of incorporating audio interviews. So that was one of the things we talked about, is having students go out and talk to elders or talk to people in their community. Video, again, this is a high production value, not what we expect from 13-year-olds in 25 hours, but it's just a model of something. This one is really a people-focused ones. There are ones about, this one is about poetry. There are some of these examples that I have on here. I actually don't remember what this one is. But different ways of looking at, this is by GLFWC, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Okay, so does that help understand what we're talking about when I'm talking about story maps and why we would want students doing this? Does anybody have thoughts on could you see how this could be used with students? Kind of a reason to do this?
Seeing some heads nodding, yes. So glad we're getting that across.
See some puzzled looks too. I have done these projects with students from 6th grade up through graduate students, and it is a very powerful, compelling way to get students to tell their story. And in this case, we really want students participating in this program to tell their story, to recognize that they have a story to tell and that their story is worth telling. So at least that's my goal. I don't know if Jim agrees with me, but. Okay. You're all being very patient after lunch. It's hard to do this. So I invite you to explore that story map, those additional story maps, and at the bottom of that page, there are other places you can find story maps. The Esri folks are here if you want to talk to them about story maps. They're a really powerful tool. Okay, Jim's moving me along. Okay, so here's the 3 options. Jim already talked about this, so I won't spend much time on it. The first tier is the 25 hours, really just focusing on story maps. Story maps do have a digital mapping technology, a very basic one. Those of you who are GIS people in the room, you will not like it. It will drive you crazy. But that's okay, because you're not doing it, right? It's a way to get students to start making maps and start seeing how to tell story with maps and how maps can help you tell the story, can help their community tell stories, can help solve problems, answer questions, solve problems.
As Shana said, with our 25-hour Tier 1 approach, what we're really trying to do is take the technology out and get into the engagement with the kids about what's important for them to share.
Yeah.
And the last piece I'll say with that, if you talk to most GIS professionals who do a lot of story maps, you can learn the templates and the technology probably in somewhere around 2 to 3 hours. The rest of the 25 is learning how to bring what you want to say into the platform.
Yeah. The 50 contact hour time is, again, these are all just guidelines, was a deeper project, hopefully having students going out and creating data, finding data, taking those dang phones that they have with them and making them put that to good use, right? You can build tools, Survey 123, collector, field maps, and have students go out in the woods and take pictures and build maps. Have them go out fishing and take pictures and build maps. Have them gathering data, interviews with people. Where on their reservation, where they live, do they feel safe? Where do they not feel safe? There's all sorts of different types of data that they can be collecting and putting together to tell stories. The Tier 3 is the one I think we're getting to that we'd like to build to, where it's more of a residential, where they either go to Haskell or they go somewhere and spend more time working on this. I like the idea of having a youth-led project where students decide something in their community that they want to make a change that has something to do with maps. And there's a lot of good examples of projects like that we could help and support people doing.
Where the Tier 3 comes in for you and your communities, if you have kids who are starting to really take to the technology and take to the field, when they come back, they can get into the subject matter that's covered in Tier 3. And again, probably in about 4 years, plus or minus a year, I would see Josh probably having one of those summer institutes, 2-week residential at something like Haskell available. And as I mentioned earlier, those are going to be the kids who self-select. And so we're not as worried about them getting lost in the technology at that point.
Some of the guiding thoughts we have that we're keeping in mind as we're going through this is that every day includes a career exploration. Again, it's going to depend on each program. Some programs might meet 8 times, some might meet 4, who know, I don't know. But every time includes some sort of a career exploration that a professional from the area, from the tribe comes and talks to the students about their career and hopefully about how they use maps, but that doesn't always have to be. And maps are used in all sorts of areas. It's not just mapping fishing and wild rice and conservation is one part. It's also mapping. The TIPOs use maps. Any of those historical preservation organizations use maps. Public health, your health clinics, your hospitals are going to use them. Your law enforcement, all of those places around the community use GIS and mapping.
And one of the things that usually most people don't even think about is when you watch the evening news and they're talking about blue states, red states, that's geo-referenced information. So we see it every day. We just don't process it in the way that we want these young folks to begin to understand those connections.
And like I said before, we learned that time on the computer must be balanced with more active activities. So we incorporated a whole bunch of those, which are really
this is the summer.
We're modeling and teaching good writing and research practices. Again, some of that digital literacy. Last year, Wendy ran into an issue where kids were really just going online, copying information and putting it into their story maps. So that type of activity is something we're incorporating, not in a school-like formal structure, but in a way of teaching kids how the appropriate ways of gathering that information. We're hoping that these projects may help them connect with elders and with people in their community. We want them outside, not just on the computers, but getting outside as much as possible. And more importantly even is giving kids choice, or some choice and agency over the projects that they choose. I thought I'd just toss up sort of a sample schedule that Wendy and I have talked about. Again, this one is designed for a 25-hour period, a 25-hour tier, so just making a story map, not getting them into ArcGIS Online, not data gathering, but really exploring storytelling. How do Indigenous communities tell stories? And spending time in that space, talking about that, doing map activities. One of the map activities could be that one in the parking lot where you're drawing your maps, telling stories, spatial stories in different ways. If you're interested, I won't go through all these, but we can.
And I'll point out, it says day 1, day 2, day 3.
Yeah,
Again, this is 24 contact hours, 25 contact hours. So when it says day 2, you're really talking about 3 hours with the kids going through what storytelling is. And that's probably the biggest Achilles heel for our pilot project, based on timing and the ability to get through the process. We didn't have an actual student youth curriculum. And Wendy did a phenomenal job, and I went to my boss and said, hey, we need to hire this woman and add her to our development team. And that's where we were able to pair her up with Shana to help update the online modules, but really to build out this piece. And
these are some suggested student activities. So the modules will have a set of lesson plans that will include all these activities. That will tell you exactly how to do them. If you want to take them, people can use them just out of the box like this. I'm guessing most people will adapt them to fit their needs, and that's totally to be expected. Yeah.
That we were talking about is that when we were looking at maps where the traditional names were put on places, that we were able to map some changes that had happened with climate change, because we were able to see where plants used to be because an area was named after them, where they no longer are, new areas where they were going, and we used that in climate adaptation planning. so that we could look for those microclimates. And so we were bringing the youth in with that because that was something like practical for their future to get them involved in. But if the language specialist hadn't brought that up to me one time when I was talking about, well, you know, where do you find these? And she's like, well, if you look at the map, this is where they used to be, like, we would never have connected that.
That's a wonderful example, thank you. And I do talk in a minute, place names are a really big part of what we hope some students will choose to do, is to start creating for themselves, but also starting to create data layers that can be shared with other people using place names from the community, so that those place names are available for other people to see. These are some examples of the things that we're putting together. The example of the parking lot map and looking at a variety of maps, and we'll go to one thing in just a minute. Looking at different types of maps. How do Indigenous people build maps? How did they build maps? How did they do spatial awareness? How do we acknowledge that traditional knowledge and respect it and continue to communicate that? How do we make GIS adapt to the traditional knowledge? That's a big charge that certainly 13-year-olds aren't going to solve, but starting to think about those kind of questions. Wendy and I came up with a concept called a yarn map. We want them to take big balls of yarn and go out to the trees and out into the woods and start to connect the trees. How might the maps, so thinking of different ways. So make a bunch of yarn out in the woods to think about different ways of connecting things and how are we connected together. Looking at tree rings, a lot of you have probably folks on the reservation or in the area who could do dendrology, is that the right word? Tree ring research, where you can do a little hole into a tree ring and start seeing how old these trees are and start making maps out of that, to kind of like learning where climate change is, where are the oldest trees, where are they disappearing. One project I've seen people do, especially with middle schoolers, it can be very compelling, is having them do a map of their community about where they feel safe and where they don't feel safe. It can be really eye-opening. I usually recommend this being done not using a computer, not using their phone, but have a big map of your area, a big paper map. Give them different colored stickers, and they can go up there on their own when they have time, and put areas where they feel are safe and not safe. For areas where they feel included or they don't feel included. Because they'll never tell you that. But if you give them a chance to put that up on a map, you might learn something. My stomping ground is an activity I use with kids all the time, where they can go into a story map and they make a very simple map. Where do they go to school? Where do their friends live? Where do they spend time after school? Where do they do sports? And they start looking at their community through that lens.
So what I would say is, I apologize on behalf of the foundation that this is only a snapshot in time. As she's going through these, I'm realizing very clearly this is Upper Midwest Woodlands Indian tribal centric, and yes, so for a lot of you, it hasn't had time to get out and capture some of your perspectives on the environment and your communities. What I will also throw in, because I don't believe it's in here, is Joseph Kursky is in charge of K-12 programming for Esri, the major large corporation, and is familiar with our project, is very supportive. And so at a point in time, I can see the foundation working with National Tribal GIS and Esri to begin to build out these educational pieces by our kids, for our kids. And I think that that's something that's exciting to look forward to over the next decade.
So this is a list of, Wendy and I just kind of brainstormed some ideas that kids could do. We really would recommend that with the 25-hour thing, that the adult mentors go in with suggested project ideas. If you open it up, it just takes too much time for the kids to decide on an idea. So go in with one or two that you're going to suggest they do. So these are just a few that we came up with. I would love to hear, I love this idea of looking at climate change through place names. I think that's brilliant. Can I use that? Can I put that in here? Thank you. Does anybody have other ideas, things you've done with kids, things you could see this being used for? Yeah, I've seen some with mascots and team names, but also where they do sports, where they compete, where they, yeah. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So with our tribe, we have a school, but it only goes up to 5th grade. So we don't use story maps, but we were trying to get them introduced to maps at an early age. So we taught the older ones, like the 4th and 5th graders, how to use a GPS tool. Very simple stuff, this is a point, this is a line, this is a polygon, right? And after a couple of days, we showed them what those look like on a map. We also showed them how to navigate to those points that we collected, right? So at the end of the week, what we did with the older kids, we had a scavenger hunt, and we would hide prizes out on the baseball field or what have you, but they had to navigate to them using the GPS tool. And so, yeah, that's what we did. We didn't have them create maps. They're a little young, on the young side, but we do try to include the youth and stuff like that.
That sounds really great. I love
fun.
the idea of getting them out and figuring out how to navigate to them in different ways. But I do guarantee your 4th and 5th graders could make story maps if you ever wanted to. You might not want to, but if you ever did, they could make them.
And I appreciate the input. It's certainly something that we had to start at one point. As we get to the end, I'm going to drag Josh up here, and he can talk a little bit more about the future. But at some point, again, this is going to be larger than just Indian Land Tenure Foundation and our local partners, and it's going to probably grab kids from 2nd, 3rd grade all the way through grad school. So it's something that we need to do to support our youth and our future leaders.
Yes. Oh. I was going to talk, this got out of order a little bit, sorry, about what our 2023 self-paced modules are for the adult mentor training. I think I mentioned that we really kind of threw everything out and started over. So we're really focusing on story maps. So kind of the exercise that I showed you just a little bit ago where they choose some story maps, look at them, start answering those questions and thinking about these questions. Okay, I gotta go talk fast. Who's the audience? What is the story coming in here? So it's answering questions and analyzing questions. That's where we're starting. The second piece is telling stories with maps, and now I don't have time to do this here. We thought we had way too much time, Jim, and look what we're doing. So we have an exercise here where we selected 4 different maps with different perspectives, all of the same place. Of the Twin Cities, sorry, that's where we're based, so that's what I did. 4 different perspectives, and looking at these 4 different maps, and what types of stories do these maps tell us? Who's the author? Who's telling us the story? What do they want you to know? And getting partly for students to understand that maps have authors, that maps are biased. Maps are not just something that is it's got a bias. And so getting to look at that, what's the difference between an Indigenous map, the Marlena Miles Dakota land maps? What's the difference between that one and the Sanborn maps? How do they tell us different stories? I don't care if the 13-year-old knows what a Sanborn map is, that doesn't matter, but it's that they can understand that these different maps are telling different stories and that they too can tell a story by building a map. Good thing we're almost done. So those are the things for the people doing the 25-hour tier. Then we do get into more of the basic cartography and ArcGIS Online, getting data. Those are more for the folks doing the bigger tiers. I'm done. I'm not going to go through this, but this is taking you through an exercise that's in the slides if you pulled it up, that it introduces you to the module where we're taking the adults through the exercise of seeing maps as storytellers.
But you did see how to get to something like an activity within the module. And so, Josh, if I could get you to join us up on stage. So the next steps is, if this is something you're interested in, certainly let us know. I'll go through a couple more pieces and then I'll turn the microphone, as it were, over to Josh. I forget if it was in the beginning or somewhere in there, it was mentioned, I mentioned that I'll be transitioning into a new role with another organization, but we had already set up to deliver this presentation, so I wanted to follow through on that. But ultimately, when I'm looking at something like this, we want to get this out there. We want to make sure that it's a resource and that it's available to everybody. So if you're interested, this is something that you should let Josh know. And as we continue to grow out and look at communities outside of our driving distance, that you're included in that development. So reach out. The other things I would say with next steps are that not only are we looking at training, we want to provide opportunities. So Josh and I have had extensive conversations that we talked a lot about the youth project. At the end of the summer, we couldn't do it because we were at LCO last year, but this year we're going to have somewhere between 3 to 6 tribal communities. We want to take kids to, so we'll start off with say 75 kids. We'll get down to about 15 to 20 kids who will travel at the end of the project summer to a central conference that we'll host in northern Minnesota, which will then give them a chance to network and share some of the successes they had from their communities. And so you're starting to winnow down the kids who are much more interested. And ultimately, like I said, we want to get that starfish. We want to find that one person or 2 women who want to eventually go into this career. So what he and I have gotten approval to do is, through a mechanism, take from that 15 to 20 kids, 2 or 3 that then we'll send next year to talk to you about their experience. Then you'll hear from the real people. You won't hear us up here chatting at you about what we think sounds great. You'll actually hear from the successful youth who've gone through this process. Not only that, what we want to do is continue supporting them, and with Josh, send them to the 2024 Tribal Youth GIS Conference so that they can begin to make those professional connections, see how others are using it in other tribal communities. And so this, again, is a process that is going to take time to build up. And we started within that driving distance, but eventually we'll have a lot of partners and we'll be able to take this to your tribal community as well. With that, Josh is going to be taking over. He is a professor of GIS technologies at Haskell, and he can do a much better introduction of himself.
Hi. My name's Josh Meisel. I'm originally from Standing Rock. I've been living in Lawrence, Kansas for the last couple decades. Went to school at Haskell, got my degree in environmental science, one of my former students. Transferred up to KU, got my master's degree, got my PhD. Recently got hired by ILTF to continue teaching at Haskell, but also take over for the Youth GIS program and also help ILTF out with any sort of mapping and GIS projects. So if anybody's interested in joining the program, please get a hold of me.
And he's short selling his work at Haskell. He's actually building a degree granting GIS program at Haskell.
Mm-hmm. We have a GIS certificate currently, but we're trying to get like an associate's and probably a bachelor's. Yeah.
And that would be great because we do have a number of tribal colleges who do that, but within the Bureau of Indian Education, there's the 2 schools, Southwest Indian Polytechnic. SIPI has a Geographic Information Technologies program, so this is an effort to kind of round that out with Haskell.
Mm-hmm. And that pretty much covers it. Yeah, get a hold of me.
Yeah, we made sure to leave you guys about 15 minutes or so to either ask questions or take a break. So please, questions. We've got one over here. Here, Ryan.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Cassandra Atencio. I'm from the Southern Indian Tribe, and I'm the Tipo there with the tribe. I wanted to know what did the youth think of it when they came out of this program, and what were their comments? Some of their comments, and what is the after story? Is there an after story from one of the students? You know, like how many came out and are now are interested out of it and developing a career? Did you have any comments about that from the youth? Because I'd really like to hear what they had to say.
From the first year, I think because we pushed so much out so quickly, we hit educational fatigue. It just was something that overwhelmed, and that's our fault. As adults, we probably should have foresaw that. And so whereas I think there was some initial excitement toward the end with, 3 hours, take a lunch and another 3 hours for 6 weeks, and then going into a 7th stretch, I I think we lost too many in that process. And again, that's our fault. That's not the kids. They did their darndest. And that's why we wanted to go and make so many substantial changes this year, so that it meets them where they're at rather than where we think we might want them to get. So I can say that in the post-program survey, we didn't get anybody who said they wanted to go into GIS or could see themselves going to GIS. But like I said, I think that's because we designed the program from an adult perspective rather than from a youth perspective. Does that sound about right?
I think it was, to expect a 13-year-old to become a GIS expert in 6 weeks is not very realistic. What I'm hoping is that we would see things throughout their career that they would feel more comfortable in some of these spaces and talking about maps. Interestingly enough, the post survey, we did a pre and a post survey that talked about their technology and familiarity with maps. The post survey actually came in, many of them ranked themselves lower on the post survey than on the pre-survey, but I actually think that was really good because I think they didn't know what they didn't know at the beginning. And then the comments in that later, they're like, oh, I realized those maps are a lot harder than I thought, or I realized I can do different things. So I was pretty comfortable with what we got back from the students. And that's one of the things we're going to design for next year is hopefully to measure their interest in science careers. We'll see.
Okay, I wanted to see what their comments were to help you design your program. Did they have any comments about how to streamline or make your program better, from their perspective and incorporating
No, we
it?
did not incorporate.
Oh, no, we did. They said very loud and clear they didn't want to be on the computers that much.
Okay.
That was a direct quote from the kids.
Okay.
And we heard that over and over again. On those exit tickets, we took those exit tickets very seriously.
Cool.
And that was a clear thing they said. They didn't want to be on the computers. So that was both on their behavior, but also they said that. And I could go back in and look at some of the...
Just wondering, from how this program, really actually, from their perspective, rather than from us as adults, because like you said, sometimes we adult it too much.
And so what we're looking at, and Josh will take care of that this summer, is we had 13 data points.
Yeah, 13 kids.
The 13 kids that gave us feedback. This summer, we'll be looking towards getting 50 data points, and I think we'll get more, we'll have the standard bell curve, and we'll get a better sense of, is that comment an outlier because somebody just had a bad experience, or is that what most of the kids are saying? But with 13 to 14-year-olds, it's hard to interpret too much, but we did get a couple of messages very loud and clear.
Okay. And then part about your traditional maps and utilizing that knowledge, I wanted to see how, because us as a tribal people, a long time ago, we didn't look at north and south. We utilized east and west where the sun moved. And so how was it able to create a map utilizing that old knowledge, utilizing the sun and seasons toward a map rather than a standard north-south, and this is north pointing up and this is south, when actually our worlds look from
I can
east
say
to
I
west.
haven't thought about it. I don't know if Shana or Josh.
Traditional methods like that can be utilized in GIS fairly easily. You could rotate a map any direction you want, and you could pivot it. You could do lots of different things with a map. So that's a good point.
I will say we did not focus on that last year, and so that's something we're including in this year more, and that's where one of the ways that Wendy and I arrived at the different concepts of having students draw maps, having students create maps or representations of place using the yarn tree, for example. So different ways of representing place and relationships, and so not locking students into the Cartesian GIS piece, but also using that to help represent. Does that make any sense? So either next year, if you come to this session, I promise you we'll have many more student comments for you, or let us know and we'd be happy to share with you in the fall after the summer. More questions? Or go get the treats.
Well, we appreciate you taking time after lunch. It's one of the
you.
hardest times to do a presentation, followed only by first thing in the morning. You've been an attentive audience. We certainly appreciate you giving some of your time to us and listening to our story. Last year, Shana and I were in front of the crowd talking about what we thought. Like I said, it was very humbling. This year, we're talking about what we did and what we're going to do to improve things. And I'm excited for the future of this project, as well as Josh's leadership as a GIS professional, that we'll have those kids next year and you'll get a much more broad experience on how this is continuing to evolve, because so much of what we do as tribal communities involves connecting information to where they are in our community. Maps just happens to be a very easily used visual reference point to that process, and I think that this is the future of how we begin to continue to take our tribal ecological knowledge and apply it in a way that can be shared across generations. So thank you again for your time on behalf of myself, Josh, and Shana.
Thank you all so much for your time. Appreciate it.